Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Flourish, a conversation on authentic gospel living. Happy Thursday to everybody. I hope this Thursday finds you doing well. I don't know what you've been doing with your morning, but I hope it was good for you. My morning has been really scattered with a number of different meetings, but good things happening. I hope that's true of your day today as well. If you're joining us live here, encourage you to drop us a message in the chat line and just let us know that you are here. I'll be monitoring that through the day. I'd love to say hello. And I'm so glad that you took time to join us. I know some of us are not very available midday on a Thursday like this, whereas some of us are. And so if you are, I'm glad you're joining us. And if you're watching this after the fact, from a recorded standpoint, welcome to you. So glad that you would take the time to join in this conversation we are having about what it means to flourish in our faith, flourish in our discipleship. We know that true life can only come through being reconciled through the work of Jesus to our Heavenly Father, and that's kind of the upward direction of flourishing in our life. But we know, as Jesus says, boils the two love commands down to love the Lord your God, your Heavenly Father, and your neighbor as yourself. So there's actually four dimensions in there that we're thinking about when we talk about flourishing in our faith. Up, down with ourselves, as Jesus mentioned, and then to our neighbor, which is actually two directions, both inward to other believers and then out. So flourishing, as we've been increasingly talking about here at Fellowship, is being formed into your discipleship to look more like Jesus by focusing on these four directions: up, down, in, and out. And as we started last week, we're focusing in on kind of that inward direction with others, specifically making peace with others. There's a lot of conflict happening, and I want to offer some real practical help and advice, and I'll get to that in just a second, but I want to say hi to Tim Bruce, good to see you. I don't know if you're out on the road today, but I'm glad you joined in. Keep your eyes on the road if you're on the road. Tim, good afternoon to Kesey, I believe, Kathy, hello, Tina, and others who are joining. Feel free, I want to interact with you, and so feel free to let us know that you are here and with us, and I hope you're prepared to interact if you can. I do want to thank you all who subscribe so you can stay connected to where we're headed with this new experimental blog and podcast called Flourish. And want you to stay connected. If you subscribed, you can still get in on some exclusive content that will be in your inbox for the next couple days. A devotional guide on Flourish. Jordan Alumi has been offering that to us, and there's a lot of good stuff there. So remember, you do get that when you subscribe. So let's talk about how blessed are the peacemakers, and how we can be a part of making peace, how we can have conflict with one another and resolve it in a biblical, godly way. So let me begin with a question I want to throw out there to all of you right now. And the question is this: growing up, how did your family deal with conflict? We all come from different families of origin with different codes and different ways of going about doing things. And I'd appreciate it if you would maybe offer some comment up on describing how your family dealt with conflict. Conflict of any kind, just regular conflict of families, or how did your mom and dad deal with conflict between them? Just offer that in the chat so we can get a sense of where we're coming from. I'm going to pick that back up in just a few minutes as you offer your thoughts on that. But give a little think on that and let us know, how did your family deal with conflict growing up? As I said, I want to offer some help in resolving conflict in your family, in your household, but also thinking about the household of faith our faith family together here at Fellowship, we encounter conflict as well. Conflict is inevitable, but broken relationships are not. So I want to draw us back to something Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, which might give us some practical handholds. And we all experience conflict, right? Especially in these days. Often these days, some conflicts become conflicts because of people's approach to, like Facebook, for example. Conflicts can flare up in any case, but I'm remembering a story someone was telling me here at Fellowship, and it related to his own family situation, how difficult it was for this person who is in an interracial marriage and has a blended family to read a post that someone in his extended family posted that didn't mean to be hurtful, but it was kind of political in nature, and it ended up hurting this gentleman I was talking to a great deal. And it ended up being something that he needed to address. There's a conflict, and had to think through how he was going to begin addressing that. I also heard from a friend who it created a conflict when somebody hashtagged a particular line, and then there was a conflict, and I could just see the wrestle, like, how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to take steps to resolve that conflict? Those are the kind of things that I want us to wrestle through and talk through today together in the series I'm calling Blessed Are the Peacemakers. And I'm kind of rooting it in Philippians chapter 4, 2-3. I read this last week. I'm going to read it again, where Paul says at the end of this letter, he says, I plead with two people. He pleads with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche. These are two common names of the time. To be of the same mind in the Lord. Verse 3, yes, I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are written in the book of life. So just that you recall this context, Paul is writing to the church that was started in Philippi, but he's writing from house imprisonment and writing from some other place. But as people came to visit him while he was under house arrest, he became aware that back in this church at Philippi, there was this conflict between two women of faith, Euodia and Syntyche. And it was important enough that he referenced it towards the end of his letter to the church at Philippi. And there's something really important that we can learn about addressing conflict and being peacemakers. And it is the fact that when Paul hears about this conflict, he's prepared to do something about it. He acts. And so that's one of several steps I want to bring out over these next couple weeks. There is this response to conflict where we must be prepared when we become aware of the conflict, that we are ready to go. And so Paul is clear and direct, but also gentle and firm in the way he calls these two out in terms of their conflict. So Paul wasn't a part of the conflict, but even he took an active stance towards it. There was a going on Paul's part by not letting the conflict go without speaking to it, because these were dear friends of Paul's. They were partners in the gospel with him. Why is it so important to go? Because conflicts grow when they're not dealt with directly and timely and biblically. That's why it's so important when we think about resolving conflict. When we become aware that there's a conflict that involves us, our natural tendency is to not go. But we've got to overcome what's natural to us and do what's biblical, which is to go and be proactive in that moment. Jesus himself says in Matthew 5:24 that when when we have a conflict, that should rate of such importance that it should even interrupt our worship. He says, if you're at the altar, leave whatever sacrifice you have at the altar and go deal with this conflict. Go, he says. Also in Matthew 18:15, Jesus talks about the importance of us initiating the going. When we are aware that we have a conflict, we should go to that other person with whom we become aware that we have a conflict and go to them. So there's this idea of going. And similarly, Paul is teaching us here in Philippians 4, we see Paul going, in a sense, in three different ways. He calls out the conflict as kind of the shepherd of these two. And he says, this is important. You two must go to one another and figure out how to agree in the Lord. He addresses it. And then he pleads with them. He says, I plead with you, Euodia. I plead with you, Syntyche. Like there is this proactive stance that he's saying, please deal with this conflict, because avoiding it is going to be no good. And then he actually enlists the help of somebody there in Philippi. We don't know who this person was. Paul calls him his true companion, somebody who knows everybody involved, and he gets help. These are very proactive ways that Paul is yielding to Jesus' instruction about how to deal with conflict. We've got to be ready to go. So let's pause for a minute and look through some of these responses about how you all responded to conflict in your family. Thanks for writing in and sharing a part of your story with us. Kathy, your conflict in your family stopped at the end of your dad's belt, so corporal punishment was a part of dealing with conflicts, I presume, with the kids. Tina says, we talked it out, was raised to look at the other person's side, being open. Neil talks about kids fighting a lot, but always were taught and encouraged to be comfortable with apologizing, which is really key there. Parents stressed that God works in the midst of conflict. That, Neil, isn't everybody's family code. And I know your father works in the peace-building kind of space because we can clearly see that that was a part of your upbringing as well. So we all have different experiences that are informed by our own family experience. For me, I can tell you that my family code in dealing with conflict was to avoid it. Act like it wasn't there, just kind of wait it out. And consequently, that set me up to, when I became aware of a conflict, not to go and move towards it, but kind of to lean away and wait for it to kind of magically resolve itself. And that has not been a very good setup for me. So those of you who dealt with conflict firsthand and directly, I think you are in an even better position to help reconcile conflict when you realize it is happening. So Paul goes on to say, and this is the last part I just want to share with you in verse 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again and rejoice. These verses 4 through 9, are often understood as being kind of standalone verses, and they work that way. There's so much truth in them. But when we put these verses up against this conflict that Paul addresses just before that, I think some insight can happen. So not only does Paul go, here's the instruction to us. One of the first steps when we encounter conflict is to go, but go with gratitude. Go with rejoicing. Paul says it twice, and he says it back to back. And he has to say it twice because it's so counterintuitive that when I become aware of a conflict I may have with you, I start rehearsing that conflict in my mind, and it leads me to thinking very negative thoughts. But Paul says if you're going to address this conflict biblically, you need to go to the person. Euodia, you need to go to Syntyche. Syntyche, you need to go to Euodia and rejoice always. Again, Paul says, rejoice. So that's kind of the first step. As we go, we need to go with gratitude, go with rejoicing. The conflict demands directness. That's the go part. But being direct can often lead to kind of a harsh, hey, we got a conflict, what did you do to me? Kind of mentality. And Paul understands that we need to go and be direct, but we have to go with soft hearts. And the best way to get there is to find a reason to be grateful. Paul even gives us a great example when he discovers that there's a conflict between these two. He says, hey, I heard you guys got a conflict. You're going to have to work this conflict out. But in that, he's saying how grateful he is to them for their partnership in the gospel with him. And he pleads out of a sense of wanting their well-being and praising God that they are a part of the church, that their names are written in heaven with others, and that they were co-workers. So even Paul is rejoicing, even as he begins to address this conflict. And this really helps here because, as I said, my family code for conflict was to avoid it whenever possible. And part of that avoidance is when we get into a conflict with somebody else, depending on our personalities especially, it can feel really nasty. It can bring up really unpleasant feelings, like it's not fun to have a conflict with somebody, and it can feel terrible, and that's why we tend to avoid things. But if we could go with gratitude, what if we could enter into a conflict relationship? What if we could have one of those crucial conversations with somebody, and instead of feeling a lot of anxiety and a lot of ill will towards that person because we have this feeling, or being scared and fearful about maybe this won't get worked out, and maybe they really hate me, maybe they've judged me, whatever feelings come up in that conflict, what if we could walk into that conflict with gratitude, not a grudge? How would that change the landscape for how we see this conflict become resolved? What if we could walk into that with a heart of gratitude, not a heart with a grudge or judgment? Think about a relationship that you have right now with whom you may be in some kind of conflict. Maybe it's a close relationship, maybe it's a couple degrees removed, it's a person you don't like because there's been a conflict that you had. Think about that relationship. I want you to just ask yourself right now as we conclude, imagine, maybe you've had this scenario where you realize you have a conflict with somebody and you are going to work it out. You're driving to meet them at a restaurant, or you're driving to meet them at their house. Imagine that car ride over to have a crucial conversation if you have spent a bit of time rejoicing about what has been good about this relationship and putting yourself in that mindset. Imagine journaling in your quiet times. As you think about this conflict, you rejoice and praise God about the things that are good about this person in your experience with him. Imagine, if you will, if we could keep the person bigger than the problem. And isn't that really key? Especially in the household of faith. That's what Paul is getting at here in these verses that follow that we'll unpack in the next couple weeks. What would it take to keep the person bigger than the problem? Because problems can be addressed. Progress can be made on the problem. But if we could go into it recognizing that relationship is really, really important before the Lord, and have that view in mind, then that would enable us to go with gratitude. So there you go. That's the thought for today, just kind of in this short time we have together to think about. One of the first steps in resolving conflicts is to go with a heart of gratitude. rather than with a sense of fear or anger or a grudge. How many of our conflicts would be resolved differently if we took some time to follow Paul's example and instruction to us? So if you are involved in a conflict relationship right now, I hope you give some thought to that, about how you can apply this principle this week to the conflicts that you may have. But we're going to leave it there for now this week, and look forward to joining you back for another step in resolving conflict next week. So hope to see you perhaps this Sunday. And I know because of the weather, we have made the call this Sunday to not be outdoors, because that wouldn't be a lot of fun with 50 and rain. So we are going to be back indoors 2 hours as normal, both 9 and 10:45, and look forward to seeing some of you there. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you back here again next week. Take care. God bless.